Kia ora, I'm Bruce Munro, and with me via Zoom is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. This week, after weeks of speculation, China has announced that it has signed a security pact with the Solomon Islands. Western countries have reacted with alarm. Welcome, Robert.
Morena, Bruce.
Why has the Solomon Islands gone from recognising Taiwan's sovereignty to a security pact with China?
Yes, it's been quite an interesting journey, isn't it? And it coincides with the Prime Minister of Solomon Islands, Manasseh Sogavai, being leader. I suppose from the point of view of the Prime Minister's position in the Solomon Islands, China has potentially much more to offer. And the Solomon Islands already has a security agreement with Australia. And the Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands is at pains to stress that this new agreement with China doesn't conflict with the agreement with Australia and is not the prelude to a military base in the country. But nevertheless, as we've seen in the last few days, the governments of New Zealand and Australia, and indeed the United States, have reacted with considerable alarm to this development.
And can I ask, you've mentioned the Prime Minister, Manasseh Sogavai. What is his role in this? I hear that he is quite a dominant figure in politics, and what role is he playing?
I think considerable, Bruce. My take on Sogavai is a bit like the words you just used. He favours, if you like, the strong man approach, inverted commas, to politics. He likes the idea of being a dominant figure. And the interesting thing here is that, in a sense, he used considerable force to put down some of the unrest which followed. There were peaceful protests which were forcibly restrained in the Solomon Islands. And both New Zealand and Australia have been involved in helping with dealing with the consequences of unrest. And the unrest has flowed from the fact that many people in the Solomon Islands were opposed to disestablishing diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Taiwan had diplomatic relations with the Solomon Islands for a considerable period of time. And then, of course, under the leadership of Sogavai, they've now switched to China. And there has been some domestic blowback against that. But I think the influence of the Prime Minister of the Solomons cannot be discounted. I think his view, the way he sees his own role in politics, perhaps would be more complementary or more consistent with partnership with China rather than Taiwan, which is democratic. And I think that he's hoping to get much more security assistance. And I think he likes the idea of dealing with a superpower like China.
So this security pact with China, is that Western countries are paying the price for having ignored the Solomon Islands? Is that what's going on here?
I'm not sure that's the case. Remember that it's not just the Western countries that the Solomons find themselves at odds with. It's actually the countries of the Pacific Forum, the Pacific Island states. And this security agreement seems to be a violation of an agreement that Pacific Island states, where they try to meet their security needs through all the membership of the Pacific Islands Forum. And so, in a sense, the big fear, as Jacinda Ardern has said, is that the Solomon Islands has now gone outside the region to a partner outside the region to enhance its security within the region. And I think that there'll be resistance to this, not just from Australia and New Zealand, but also a number of Pacific Island states, which feel that any militarization of the region flowing from the actions of the Solomon Islands will not be in their interest. So I think this is a regional problem as well as if you like, a global problem from a Western perspective.
So what is it that Western countries and other Pacific Island nations are actually scared of happening?
Well, I think they're very concerned. Prime Minister Sogavare has said that there is no intention to establish a Chinese military base in the country. But notice the choice of words, no intention. There is concerns that a military base and military forces Chinese military forces will, sooner or later manifest themselves. And I think that the concern there is, from an Australian New Zealand point of view, should a potentially hostile power have a military base in the Solomon Islands, then that could have considerable complications for our ability to interact. When I say our, I mean Australia and New Zealand's ability to interact with the wider Indo-Pacific, because that would be a commanding position in terms of our sea lanes that flow from around our borders through to the Indo-Pacific. So there is some concern there. And, historians have recalled that during the Second World War, the Japanese also tried to limit New Zealand and Australia's interactions with the outside worlds by getting such a commanding position in the Pacific Islands.
Let's talk for a moment about that prospect of a military base in the Solomon Islands. I noted that China has leased an island off, what was the name of that island? China has leased the island of Tulagi off of the Solomon Islands. It's a small island. It's intended for a refinery, they've said, but it could potentially give them that opportunity to develop a military base there?
Well, that's where the speculation is. And under this security agreement, it certainly provides for some Chinese police and military training assistance. But that's all to do with the containment of security problems within the Solomons. But yes, I think that this is one of the big fears about this security agreement, that it could be a catalyst for a further agreement. And we know that the United States is sending quite a high-powered delegation led by Dr. Kirk Campbell to the Solomon Islands later this week to discuss the situation with the Solomon Islands government. Now, there is some disappointment in Washington, and indeed in Australia and in Wellington, that the Solomon Islands have effectively preempted the visit of Dr. Campbell and his colleagues from the United States by signing this agreement. But I don't think it's as cut and dried as that. The agreement, from what we can learn, is quite vague. And I think Dr. Campbell and his colleagues will be trying to narrow it down as best they can, to limit as best they can diplomatically the Chinese role in the Solomon Islands.
So how likely is it that these fears will actually be realised? Western countries, particularly the US, has military bases in different bits of the world. Yeah. And we think, well, they're defending their interests. They might be there to defend democracy. What's to say that China isn't just doing something, similar and positive? Are any of these fears actually justified?
Very difficult to gauge, but China has certainly been much more forward-leaning and geostrategic in its foreign policy since about 2012 under Xi Jinping. And I think the concerns about China's role have, if anything, been underlined by its ambiguous stance following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I was struck by the fact that the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, who's been currently in a tour involving Singapore and Japan, mentioned in a press conference, I believe, in Singapore, that the democratic countries were particularly sensitive now following the flouting of the international rules-based system by Russia to challenges to it. So I think, in a sense, we should not be surprised that China's rise to superpower status means that it wants some of the diplomatic and strategic perks that go with that status, and is, if you like, expanding its diplomatic interests. The question is whether China will seek to provide the sort of assistance to help entrench leaders in developing countries such as the Solomons, which they favor. And that's the big worry, really, that it could be argued that relations between China and its allies is qualitatively different than Western countries and its allies. As far as I know, Australia and New Zealand have no desire to determine who becomes leaders in the Pacific Islands. They may favor some leaders over others, but they won't take steps to bring that about. And there's a concern that an authoritarian power like China, which does not tolerate political opposition, may be quite attracted with its doctrine of non-interference in domestic affairs to heavily supporting someone like Manasseh Sogavare in a way that Western leaders would perhaps hesitate to do so.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Ka kite anō.